Well, welcome back to Inside the Pastor Study Podcast. I'm Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
It is great to be back in the studio. We are a father and son pastoral team serving a local church in Methuen, Massachusetts. And this podcast exists to help those of you who are joining us get an idea on what pastors chat about throughout the week, the things that we think through and discuss and work through, the way that culture influences some of the things that we're talking about. But it's really the conversations that you can't just bring into a pulpit or a lectern, but are still influenced by our love for the Lord and our love of Scripture. And so we're glad you've joined us and tuned in. If you're there with us on YouTube, hello, hit the things that you're supposed to do on YouTube. That'd be great. If you're on one of our podcast apps, one of the ways that you can help us there is to do the rating stuff and the sharing stuff. All those things are helpful. We'll just get those out of the way. Everybody's supposed to talk about it. It's a rule whenever they give you your microphone. In the case with the microphone is the reminder to ask people to do stuff with what they're hearing. So so there it is. Comment, all those things. Yeah, yes. So there we go. I've fulfilled the obligation of podcast host at this point, and from here on, we can just talk about stuff.
Good. Oh, yeah.
All right. So welcome. We're glad you're here with us. We're going to kick off our episode this week with a theological term.
The theological term of the week. This week's term is sacrament.
Sacrament. It kind of sounds like sacerdotalism.
It does. Yeah, comes right out of the same concept.
Yeah. My wife, after last week's podcast, she said, I have never heard the term sacerdotalism in my life.
There you go.
We thought, I thought that was probably going to be the case.
Yeah.
It's not one that gets thrown around a lot. I think a lot of these theological terms are words that you hear used, but you don't necessarily know the full meaning of them, right?
Right.
But that one, I think, was probably just totally outside of most people's
if you're not a pastor,
vocabulary. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So sacerdotalism, which is a reminder, it was kind of a discussion around a polity or a system of
based upon a priest, someone who bridges the gap between the sacred and the secular.
Yes. So their job is to kind of be that intervening voice.
Right.
Between the common believer and the Lord.
Yeah.
And for low church, traditions like ours, we'd say we use something called the priesthood of all believers.
Yes.
And we would say that everybody has that access because of Christ and the Holy Spirit.
Right. Exactly.
So that's one of the big differences there.
Right.
So out of that thought process is this word that kind of sounds a lot like sacerdotalism, sacrament.
I thought we should hit it right away, this whole concept of sacrament, because a sacrament is something that makes a person holy.
Yeah, and this is a key word. Honestly, I think, so we've both ministered in areas over our life and ministry that are heavily Catholic.
Yes.
Yes. We both served in separate churches in New Jersey, which is a very Catholic area that we lived in. And even up here, it's probably not as Catholic as it was down there in New Jersey, but still heavy Catholic influence here. Right. And so I think that there is a big misunderstanding, particularly with people who've come out of Catholic backgrounds and this idea of sacrament, right?
Well, and I would say this for our Catholic friends who might be watching us, and I just used the term that a sacrament is something that makes a person holy. There is probably an understanding among very devoted Bible reading Catholics that a sacrament doesn't make a person holy as much as it improves a person's holiness.
Okay.
So I would say that the average run-of-the-mill Catholic person sees a sacrament as something that's going to put him in a better stead with God.
It's like a discipline that's part of the sanctifying process?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for the average Roman Catholic, they're not distinguishing between going to hell because they didn't participate in sacraments and not going to hell because they so on. So I think that for them, there is a reality that it makes them holy, and if they miss it, there's the possibility that they would go to hell or purgatory, as the case may be,
Mm-hmm.
that there would be something that would intervene or keep them from the presence of God.
So there's a penalty for missing a sacrament.
There is a penalty, but and I think that there are many Roman Catholics who more deeply understand, at least from their perspective, what's going on. And for them, a sacrament is just something that makes their experience with God more enjoyable, more of a reality. It is. It would be similar to a discipline, yeah.
Okay.
So, but sacramental churches are churches that practice these holiness actions, and you have to participate in them. If you do not, then the church would cut you off because you are not holy. You haven't practiced the sacraments.
Yeah, so these are some of those disciplines that you associate with Catholicism and other,
right?
So the Holy Communion
is a sacrament,
right?
Right.
Confession is confession.
So the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, as I remember them. Now I'm
been not in that world.
I have not been in that world, but if the sacraments as I remember them, that maybe there would be somebody who would add to these for us in our show notes or in the comments below.
Yeah, head to Google. Yeah, so if you're a former Catholic or are a Catholic and you're listening, throw that in the comments below. Let us know.
But I know that baptism is a sacrament. Holy Communion is a sacrament. Penance or confession is a sacrament. Marriage is a sacrament. Holy orders, in other words, becoming a priest. So obviously you can't do all of these because either you're going to be married or you're going to be in holy orders, one or the other, right? And then the last one I know of is holy or final unction.
Okay,
or last rites, as it's sometimes called, but final unction or the final work of the Holy Spirit in your life before you die. And that's one of those interesting things about doing pastoral visits for the dying. Yeah. Because when I go in to visit somebody who's dying, what I do with them is I just say, all right, I know that you've come to my church forever, and I know that this is your testimony, but let me just go over this, and I will review with them that person who's dying, the plan of salvation, or if I've never met that person and it's like, oh, my father-in-law is dying, would you come? What I do is I just go through the plan of salvation very clearly, very distinctively, I'm going to say starkly. I don't leave it up to, these are decisions that you might want to put off. This is a decision you have to make now. Are you making this decision or
have you, or can you assure me that you've made, or can you be assured that you've made this decision?
You can be assured of it. And so I'll review that, but I'm not going to make any prayer over them that they find rest and solace in God.
Right. Cause you're not a priest.
I'm not a priest.
Right.
I can't.
Well, you are, but you're not that kind of priest.
I'm not that kind of a priest. Right. I have no ability to move the Holy Spirit on their behalf. Actually, none of us do, which is a very interesting point, but I'm not going to be able to do that. So, And interesting aspect of that, like if you're a military chaplain during a time of war, even if you're a Protestant chaplain, you may be called upon to give last rites to a dying soldier just because it's in your role as a chaplain to take care of all religions in every way. So you have this.
It's an interesting conflict. I actually had the opportunity to go into the chaplaincy early on, and that was a thing that was kind of hard for me to overcome in that process. Like the idea of having to make some sort of accommodation for all faiths. So that was an interesting conundrum, and I'm not sure. I wasn't sure. I knew I could get to a place where if I needed to, where I could wrestle with that and figure out a way of managing it, but I also just didn't feel that tug, and so I went into the pastorate instead.
So from a non-sacerdotal world, which is what we are, we don't practice sacraments.
Yeah, which is a confusing thing, particularly for our members and attenders who have come out of Catholicism. They'll often use this word sacrament and they talk about communion. There will be confusion, I've noticed, depending on how Catholic they are, on even our communion practice. Right.
For the first,
why don't we do it every week? Because they start to feel really uneasy about us not doing communion every week.
Because what if I die between now and the next first Sunday of the month, right?
Yeah.
I'm
not sure I'm covered or
I'm not covered.
as covered.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel that tension in my recent.
It's not going to make
Catholics.
me holy, even the individual for whom their Catholicism isn't a matter of, it's going to make me holy. It's more of a matter of, is it going to put me in the right stead with God? Is God going to say, well, you didn't take communion in the last 3 weeks? I don't know if.
Yeah. So why are we non-sacramental?
So we're non-sacramental because the concept of making a person holy, we don't have sacraments. To introduce another word.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could do this as a compare contrast.
Yeah, just to introduce another word. In most congregational liturgies and polities, we don't have sacraments. We have, the other word is ordinances.
Mm-hmm.
And the word ordinance is just the word, it's from the word work,
mm-hmm.
and ordo. So it's a work, not a saving work, but more of a work that is done as part of who we are as believers. So there's no salvation in our works. It is instead like the Ephesians 2:10 concept, where we are his workmanship and foreordained to good works that we should walk in them. So among those good works is the obedience of following God in baptism, and the remembrance of Christ's sacrifice on our behalf in a memorial on a regular basis in communion.
Yeah, and we really only have two, right?
That's it. Yeah, that's all we have.
Most churches that share a similar background as us. It's really just those two ornaments,
just those two
ordinances, and we see the practice of those as an act of obedience.
Yes,
and so you can be disobedient, and it will impact your relationship with God.
Yes, it will.
And so there's some crossover in a sense in these two concepts, which is why I think it can be confusing for many.
Right.
But we're saying like the actual sanctification work is in the hands of and under the purview of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And because of the other word we've used in the past, because of our justification by grace, through faith, right? Because of that justification work, our practice of communion or baptism does not change our status.
No.
At all.
Absolutely.
It only changes the joy of our obedience.
True.
Right?
You could go years without celebrating communion.
Yeah.
And God would not look at you any different.
He would.
You probably would.
I think it would have an impact on you.
For it. Yeah. You would desire it. But it wouldn't create.
It does not downgrade your mansion to a townhouse in heaven.
No, it does not. It doesn't even move you out of town.
Yeah. So, right, it's obedience. It's an obedience issue, not a salvation issue.
Yes, absolutely.
And the sacraments really are tied more closely in with salvation.
Right.
And so there is the distinction, which is why we try to parse those a little bit.
Right. That's why we use a different word.
Struggle with that.
Talk about ordinances as opposed to sacraments. And it's interesting because we, as evangelicals, highly value marriage.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good thing. But it's not an ordinance. It doesn't make me any closer to God.
Right.
Which also means that if you're not married, and just have not found the right one, or the right one hasn't found you, and you live your life in singleness, or you just are one of those people, and there are lots of these folks who are comfortable without a spouse. You're not removing something from your holiness because you haven't gotten married.
Right.
There's a great deal of pressure on in many Roman Catholic and sacerdotal world where, if you don't get married, if you don't get a church wedding.
Yeah.
If you're not married in the church, there was a day, then some folks maybe who are older and watching us on YouTube, I don't know if people who are older than me actually podcast that much, but it'd be good if you did. I mean, it's worthwhile. But there was a day when you might get married at the Justice of the Peace,
Mm-hmm.
or you might run off to the local Baptist church and the Baptist pastor might marry you.
Yeah.
But then you'd have to go back to the Catholic Church and get married all over again.
Right.
And, there's this whole crazy thing with Catholicism where if you just had a civil wedding, even if you have 10 kids, you can go and get an annulment because you just had a civil wedding. So you were actually technically in the Roman Catholic Church idea, you were never actually married in the sight of God.
Because you weren't married within the church.
Because you weren't married within the church. So there's that sacrament concept going at that case that, you did a work, you didn't do anything that made you holy.
Yeah. Interesting.
And so, you've got sacramentalism going in there and the whole concept of confession. Listen, it's a good idea to stay fessed up before God. That's between you and him.
Yeah. And there are times I think frequency, there are times where confession to a believer, to a fellow believer, a brother or sister in Christ is really, really important. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
It's not to remove the importance of any of these items, right? Like it's important confession to another believer is important. Making sure that you are firm in your belief of the gospel and your trust in the Lord before passing away is important. Being active in your church's rhythms and remembrances is important. Like we don't devalue any of those items, right? And a lot of those items we move into this realm of obedience and disobedience.
Sure.
But we don't move them beyond to this place of salvation or penalty that puts you out of God's favor and even out of God's presence.
Right. Or makes you more favorable to God, right?
Right. Yeah. Or increase your...
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, even the whole idea of holy orders, right?
Yeah.
To actually pursue
the priesthood. Yeah.
The priesthood. It's, the scripture says that the man who desires to be an elder or a pastor desires a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And scripture says that you're supposed to hold that man in double honor, right? But I used to have, my dad is buried in a cemetery that has, it's a multi-denominational cemetery. And I remember there would be gravestones and it would be like John Smith and it would say religious. First time I saw that, I was maybe, 8 or 9. And I said to my mother, what does it mean religious? There's lots of us that are religious. And it was like, oh, what that stone is saying is he was a priest.
Huh.
He was a religious order. So he was a priest or a monk or something that was supposed to set him aside. And he wanted everybody to know on his gravestone that he was set aside because he had engaged in the sacrament of holy orders. I don't know that God's going to read the man's gravestone.
Yeah.
I don't think he cares. I think he cares about the heart and he cares about our relationship that we've established with Christ, not the things that we want to do to make us look like we're better.
Yeah. So I think it leads me to that final step, maybe, and we can move into some other topics. But I feel like there are a lot of divisions on how we approach God and our own works, right? But I think that coming out of a pseudo reformed thinking, my main perspective on this is that God does all the work because he's holy and I am not. And I am, I am the lowly scum who has been rescued by a gracious God.
Yeah.
And the more I can put into the hands of God's authority and power, the happier I am. Maybe the less comfortable I am, because I think that there's always this piece of me that wants to war with God for my own control.
Yeah.
And there's this, I think there's a constant fight between who is God in this relationship. And my responsibility as a lover of Jesus is to continue to put that at his feet and say, no, you are Lord, right? And I think a lot of these issues, for me, it comes down to like who's God and who's in control and who has ownership over their destiny.
Yes.
And I am much more comfortable placing the ownership of my destiny in the hands of Jesus.
Absolutely.
Than to have them on my own hands, because I know that I will mess this up.
Yes.
We were talking about the other day, I saw a quote from a pastor, John MacArthur, who said that if we could, what was it? If we could lose our salvation, we would.
We would.
Right?
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
and he's talking about eternal security and all this too, right? But like that, we're desperately wicked and we're a mess. And even when you read Paul, he has this whole like super confusing verse about, I want to do stuff and I'm incapable of doing it. Right. I want to do good things and I just keep messing it up. And I think that's who we are.
Yeah.
And so I think the perspective of many Protestants, there's variation in this, but I think the perspective of many Protestants is this is God's work. And I am graciously redeemed by him. And I live out of obedience to all of the effort that he's put into this relationship. Right.
Which is the key word. That's the key word, is the obedience word. Because, you can go the other perspective. I know many, I'm not going to use another term just because I don't want to.
We've already thrown them in the water.
Right?
Yeah, it gets muddy.
But, there are those people who are just, they're saved and maybe they even know everything that there is to know about their salvation, but it has no effect on their daily lives. And they'll say to you, well, I'm fine because I'm saved.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can continue to do whatever I want to. There's no discipline. We talked about discipline last week. There's no discipline in their life. There's no structure. There's no effort to be sanctified and growing.
Mm-hmm.
Sacraments do not make you saved, nor do they sanctify you. Your heart attitude sanctifies you and makes you holy. Your obedience to what God says makes you holy.
Yeah.
I suppose if you are engaging in sacraments and want to remain in a sacramental and sacerdotal world, and you identify those things as statements of your
devotion and obedience
to God, then so be it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that they make you saved. They don't make you or keep you holy.
Yeah.
You are not going to purgatory because you missed your last communion before you died.
Right.
Or your last confession, or your final unction, or finding Mr. Right.
Mm-hmm.
None of those things is going to keep you from enjoying the pleasure of God's presence for the rest of eternity.
Right. The only thing that keeps you from enjoying God's presence for eternity is the rejection of the gospel.
The only sacrament that there is trusting Jesus.
Yeah. I think back, I scrolled through something yesterday and it just reminds me of this. Like, my perspective on God's work is a lot like the interaction that God has with Abraham in that major covenant where God puts Abraham to sleep, or Abram to sleep.
Yes.
And like they've already laid out the covenant work, right? In the day when you made a covenant with somebody, you sliced up a bunch of animals.
Yeah.
You met in between, you shook hands, and that
joined arms.
You joined arms. And you walked through the carnage. And that was a statement of, if I break this promise with you, then I will end up like the carnage we're walking through.
Exactly.
Right? And God, in this beautiful, beautiful like moment, puts Abram to sleep and walks through on his own. And says, if the covenant is broken by either party, the person who walks through will end up broken and displayed.
Yes.
Right? And so because we broke that covenant repeatedly, God fulfilled his end of the promise and walked through and openly faced carnage and death and destruction. Right? So that was the statement from the beginning with God's people. The covenant he made with his people is, I am going to cover the cost of this penalty.
Yes.
Of brokenness, of sin, and of this broken covenant.
Yes.
And that's what he does in Jesus. And like, for me, to add anything to that work is to say, no, let me wake up from this dream and walk through this with you so that I have some ownership in this.
Yeah, no.
And I don't see it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
But there you go. So if you talk to me, about the sacrament of communion and you see me looking squirrely and uncomfortable, now you know why.
Yeah.
It's just, I get what you're saying. I'm going to treat you with grace, and I'm not the guy who's going to like give you a vocabulary lesson in the back of the sanctuary.
I'm not going to beat you for that one.
But this is what I'm thinking.
Yes.
This is what's going on in my head if you have that conversation with me. He's like, it's an ordinance, but okay, I love you. Let's
let's just move on.
Yeah. Well, the first of the month is coming up. We'll do communion then.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Because as often as you do it, you know.
Right.
It's an interesting
Hey, look,
statement.
I have friends in the Grace Brethren Church. 4 times a year.
Yeah.
4 times a year.
Yeah.
They do it with a foot washing.
That skeeves me out.
Yeah, but then they...
I don't think I could ever be Grace Brethren just because of the foot washing thing.
Just because of the foot washing thing, huh?
Yeah. It's too much for me.
Yeah.
Feet are gross. It's a sacrament too far.
There you go.
All right. Well, there is our extended theological term of the week.
The theological term of the week.
So this past Sunday, our church celebrated its 100th anniversary.
Woohoo!
100 years of ministry, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, it is.
What percentage of churches in America do you think are 100 years old or older?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't even think through that number.
That'd be fun. That'd be a fun statistic, right?
It would, wouldn't it?
I wonder if Barna has done that work. But
because you think about it, the country itself is only 240 years old.
Yeah, and so like up here, we're accustomed to things having a little more age on them.
Yeah, that's
up here
true.
in New England, right? Like, there's some towns when you enter into towns around here, you see the founding date on the town sign typically.
Right.
And most of those have a 16 or a 17 on them.
Yep, absolutely.
And so, so the age thing is easier here than it might be in like Hawaii.
Right. I mean, there's actually even a house next door to the church that I think was built prior to the French and Indian War. So
it's cool stuff.
Yeah.
There was a house that went on the market. I saw this recently. There was a house that went for sale this summer that had been in the same family for like 6 or 7 generations, and it was built in the late 1600s. Yeah. It's one of the oldest houses to go for sale in the country in years.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool stuff up here, right?
Absolutely.
But 100 years of service to the kingdom here at Marsh Corner Community Church, which is really a great it was a great celebration.
Sure,
it was really fun.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many churches out there are like that.
Such a great history too, because the church started as a Sunday school.
Mm-hmm.
They're just a group of people who loved Jesus and wanted to teach that to kids, and they actually went through probably what was a very rural section of our town of Methuen, right? And just went from door to door and said, we're going to do a Sunday school every Sunday morning, and invited kids to come. And I think they had 30 children the first week. And it was, I think that was in 1914. And then by the time 1922 came along, they were ready to
call it
a church. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking through that. Can you imagine like today doing a church plant, but not, and just saying, hey, we're going to do a kids program on Sunday mornings. And that's just going to be what we do. That's the only thing, is a kids program on Sunday mornings.
So,
and do you think that would get funding from a denomination?
I don't know. But now I've known of churches that have begun, like, I knew of a church that started as a basketball ministry.
Huh. Yeah.
They started, they built like a pole barn, and they invited people to come and play basketball. They did basketball leagues, set up all kinds of leagues in the town. It was just a good opportunity for people who loved basketball.
Mm-hmm.
So they had like a men's league and a women's league and lots of different children's age group leagues. And they would start each basketball game with prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And during the day, they would have various times when they would do
like devotionals.
Devotionals,
that's
right?
Cool.
And over time, this church grew to a place that was absolutely huge, to the point where when they actually built a building, their auditorium was still had basketball hoops. Had like 6 or 8 basketball hoops, and all of the markings on the floor so that they could play basketball tournaments, take the chairs out and play basketball tournaments in the main sanctuary.
Huh.
So there's another SANC, another holy word.
Sanctuary. That's right. It's an auditorium.
Yeah, it's a holy room.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So,
So that's fun. Yeah, when I was in college, I had, for a while considered doing a church plant out of a coffee shop. Kim and I had both worked in coffee shops. I'd helped start one, and so I kind of knew like the business side of making coffee work, and thought like that would be kind of a fun thing to do, is to start, just begin with the business and let it self-support, and then have these, alpha groups or other things meeting throughout the week, and then teaching people and discipling people and letting it grow into a church out of that.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of creativity in how these things start. But I was just thinking, like, a Sunday morning, like, kids discipleship program with nothing else is interesting. Like, but that's how we started here.
That's how we started, right?
Yeah.
So that was like the seed that was planted, and then the church grew into a place where people, they wanted to gather and actually worship God together.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had a worship era that grows out of that. There are a couple of pastors that follow each other for about 40 years. And then, interestingly enough, so that church, it was just a very community-oriented church at the time.
Yeah, we have a timeline posted in our hallway of different things that have happened in those first, 30, 40 years. And I saw things on there that I was like, oh, I don't theologically agree with that.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's because of where the church is going. So they recognized that they needed to worship God together. But there's a possibility even that even in the 40s and 50s, the people talking about worshiping God may have not been talking about the same God.
Mm-hmm.
And then an interesting thing happens in the 50s because a man comes in and preaches just to fill in the pulpit because their last pastor had died. And he fills in the pulpit and he shares the gospel and people get saved. And this church actually becomes a church, which is interesting enough. So 100 years, some of that 100 years you would look at it and you'd say, well, I don't know, because you have this huge Reformation moment that takes place. We have folks that were in the church at that time. Some of them have talked to both sides of that because they were talked to people who left the church because of that watershed moment in the 50s and that pastor, and they didn't like the fact that he was calling people to salvation because they felt that they were already saved. And then they've come back since having been saved, and they're like, we still don't, we thought it was okay. It was okay what he did. We just didn't like the way he did it, kind of a deal. Just kind of a...
It's funny, the mythology, like the way I had originally heard it, right, is that this guy comes in and everybody half the church gets saved and the other half leaves, right? Yeah. And so it's fun to kind of, I've talked to some of those people also, right? And you get more of that story. It's like, no, he was just really hard-headed and like over the top, and I didn't like him, right? And, like, pastors, they're tough.
They are tough.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting story, right?
Yeah, right.
And so now we're at this point now where we've weathered a lot as a church.
We have. Yes, we have.
Right?
We've gone through some issues.
You're planted in the 20s. It means the church got to experience the Depression.
Yes.
The church got to experience World War II.
Yeah.
The church got to experience the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the rise and fall of the hippie movement. Up here in New England, there's all kinds of like tension. It's gone through all of that, like, political turmoil, COVID, all of these things have been
one time
part
the
of
church,
the story here.
This church had a bus ministry, and they were running like 5 or 6 different buses to different communities, and they were busing children into Sunday school.
Yeah.
It was, and so there's even the bus ministry era that was so popular in the late 60s and 70s and disappeared for the most part in churches in the 80s. Except for here, where it carried on all the way up through the 2000s. Yeah. So, I mean, it's been an interesting life cycle to get us to 100 years. I think it's difficult, quite honestly, to be a church of 100 and to move on to be a church of 200. I know that there are churches like that in the United States, but I think that it's hard to be a church of 100 and going on to a church of 200 because there are life cycles in a church. Yeah. Call them generational.
Sure. And the last thing you want is for your church building to become one of those art studios.
Very
popular up here in New England. Like the little the little white building that is clearly a church building that's now an art studio or a community center or
ballet
studio, or a bar.
Yeah.
It's
Houses. I've seen some that have been turned into houses. And
some of those are pretty cool looking.
Yeah, like straight out of Alice's restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because we just went through Thanksgiving, so we can refer to that.
You got to listen to it every year. So how do you think, we'll hit this on two angles, right? So how do you think a church gets to be 100 years old?
So I think that a church gets to be 100 years old because it has a driving force. There's something about that church that unites a group of people and moves them forward in a driving force or a causality, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It unites them. Now, there are so many churches, even so many evangelical churches, even so many evangelical churches per square mile. And they're all different because so many of them have a different driving force. I'm not talking about purpose here. I realize all of us as churches have the same basic 5 purposes.
Sure.
And I'm not going to get into that. But a lot of times churches have a driving force too. Like you'll have hymn churches and rock and roll churches and
country churches,
country gospel,
country
churches,
music churches,
right?
Yeah, cowboy church.
Yeah, your cousin, my niece.
Yeah.
When she went to Texas for a while to go to college, and she was excited because she actually developed her relationship with Christ at a cowboy church. And there are different driving forces, and that driving force unites a group of people and moves them along, and makes the church grow because they're finding other people who share that same driving force. So, for example, in Marsh Corner, the driving force was children's ministry.
Yeah.
It was that need to do a Sunday school ministry. And when you move into the 70s, the 60s and 70s,
with the buses,
you already have this driving force of we have a growing, thriving Sunday school, which Sunday school, if you go back to our previous podcast, you'll know that Sunday schools between the 1950s and 1970s, that was
revolutionary.
Revolutionary. That was the way you made sure your children weren't blacklisted as being communists because your kids went to Sunday school or you went to Sunday school, and you could therefore claim that you weren't an atheist because atheism and communism were tied so uniquely together. So Sunday school has always been a driving force here. And because there is this driving force of I'm going to minister to children and have children's ministries, there are a lot of people that glom onto that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the driving force is a Christian school. Okay? That can be a powerful driving force. Sometimes the driving force is a desire for outreach to the poor and the indigent.
Sure.
And you have a church that's just united by we're gonna get together every Saturday night and go feed the poor under the highway overpass. So there are driving forces that keep a church moving and can take a church to age 100 because they understand that they need to, and here's how you get to 100, because obviously the people who were the driving force in 1922
don't exist.
They are not here anymore.
Yeah.
Right? We had the pleasure of having a former pastor, Pastor Steve Jeans, back some weeks ago. And Pastor Steve was a member at Marsh Corner and then became the pastor. And in his lifespan, in his time here, he was actually at Marsh Corner for, I think, 35 years in one way or another. 35 years, that's like a third of the church's life cycle. And I think that in some ways, because of where he was, he bridged that idea of children's ministry.
Yeah.
He brought it from, I think that it was already a vital Sunday school ministry, or school bus Sunday school ministry by the time he became pastor. But I think that you see that driving force in the 1922 church just being carried through. And Steve is this conduit that makes sure that the Sunday school focus is here And at the same time,
and youth ministry too, right? Like
Yes.
all of that. Yeah. That
Yeah.
what we now call next generation ministry.
next generation ministry,
You know,
right?
Still very,
Yeah.
very big deal.
Yeah.
Which you talk about like these multiple driving forces, and church I served in prior to this, like I think for a while, their driving force was a Christian school.
Yeah.
And that had come into such conflict in that church family. Like there was a major conflict between the administration of that Christian school and the leadership of the church, that it created exceptional disruption. And in the years since, like, I've lived here for about a decade now, and in the years since, that church has essentially been replanted. Like it's under a new name, mostly new leadership, and the Christian school no longer meets at that in their facility.
Right.
In the sense that they're a church that lost their driving force.
Right.
And they became, they're near, at certain points were near death.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a thing. Like, I think that some churches can lose sight of their driving force, and then they're flirting with death at that point. It's a good way to not make it to 100. Or once you're at 100, if you lose that and you lose these bridge people, you lose what has made your church unique and has given it passion and given it direction and mission. And if you don't replace that with some other, important element of serving the King, then you're in danger. And so, I think churches can run into that. I think it's like a purpose and a mission and a vision. Like I think those things help a church get to be 100. It doesn't have to be the same one all along, but it has to exist. Yes. And when churches miss that and they kind of fall out of that, it's a good way to not make it to 100 or not make it to 200.
Right. So I actually would semi-quibble with you for a second here. Okay. Ready? Yeah. In strategic church planting, there is something called an S-curve, right? Because if you think normal lifespan, here's how things go. You start off as a seed. For those of you who are watching.
It's visual element.
We're going to do visual, right? You start off as a seed. You ramp up. You get really excited.
You go up the roller coaster hill.
Growing. You start growing slower. Top of the roller coaster hill, things start to slow down, right?
Yeah.
You get to the top. This is your apex. This is the moment when you are the great church.
Thinks they're as good as they've ever been at your church.
But you've lost sight of your driving force, or your driving force has gotten old
or fulfilled.
Yeah, exactly. And now you're starting to go this way, maybe slowly, but you're still going to start going this way. And then all of a sudden you hit that ramp and you're out. And now you've got a trustee who's dividing your property up and selling it up and giving it to a missionary agency somewhere. Yeah. Which of course is another driving force, is missions.
Totally.
But I think that the key ingredient is, instead of when you get here, instead of heading up over the hill, you said you change your driving force or
redefine or re-envision.
I think it's more of revisioning your driving force. So, for example, here at Marsh, we're 100 years. Our driving force has always been next generation ministries. If we were to suddenly change and say, from now on, now that the church is 100 years old, we are going to be a
missionary church.
We're going to be a missionary church. We're going to start funding more missionaries and sending out missionaries. We're going to try and create as many missionaries as possible. We're going to do a mission trip every year, right? We're now in a problem because all of the people who have come to Marsh in the past, because they've been driven by children's ministries, now they're at this crest. And it's like, oh, do I want to stay with that new driving force? And things go downhill.
Yeah.
Or here's the other thing that happens. Because you haven't redefined your driving force of children's ministry, everything else creeps in or redefines. So,
and cloud out your original.
Let me give you a Marsh Corner case at hand, right? Marsh Corner, driving force, children's ministry. But in driving force of children's ministry, we saw the responsibility of missions, and at one point, almost 35% of Marsh Corner's budget was going to missions,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome,
Mm-hmm.
except that it was sucking money out of everything else in the church.
Which suffocates your driving
Which
force.
suffocates your driving force of children's ministry. But I think that if you had walked through Marsh in those days and said, so what's the driving force of Marsh Corner? You would have had some people say, oh, we have a great missions program and look at our missions trips. And
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not downing missions trips as part of your driving force.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing. Your driving force of missions trips has to be to advance your next generation ministry.
What can be. So this is, again, I think this just takes like some wisdom and leadership and some intentionality, right? Like
Yes.
this is a thing that you, like, 'cause what I'm hearing you say is like, wow, then you've got to pick your flavor of church. And if it's not it, then like, don't ever change it, right? Like this is, the church was founded as a Bible study in a bar. Make sure you never take the keg out of the church. Right? Because that's its driving force, is this group of people who gather around and, have these deep conversations while enjoying
It sounds like a
frosty
Lutheran
beverage.
church.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Or Lutherans, Presbyterians. Yeah. So, and you can never change that. It has to be the driving force forever or you will kill it. And I don't know what I would agree with that, but I think it would take like intentional leadership and great visioning to be able to shift it, right? Like,
Sure.
so like, let's say you're here in the 90s when Marsh starts exploding in this mission mindset,
Yeah,
right? Which is
yeah.
what kind of happens, right?
Right.
And so you have dual, the church had kind of these dual hearts for next gen ministry and for missions.
Right.
And they did often blend the two, right?
Yes.
Like your teens are going on mission trips every other year, and that's
Yes.
awesome. And we still do mission trips, right?
Yes.
But not at the same rate that it was done before. Like you can, as a leader or as a leadership team at that point, like sit down with your congregation and say, what do we want? Like, and I think that's the key. Like when
Yeah.
you're finding those moments of clouding or blending, like it's a great moment to be at the crest of that roller coaster hill and say, okay, like I see this new heart for missions, but we have also had this historical heart for next generation ministries.
Yeah.
I am letting you know what I'm seeing, and I want you as a congregation to know what we're seeing. And like we cannot, based on who we are, like we're that church of 300 people, based on who we are,
Right.
we can't sustain both of these things with excellence. We can't let both of these things be our heartbeat because it won't quite work. So which one do you want?
Yeah. It's
'Cause
yes.
this is what it looks like.
Yes. Or how do we blend it?
How do we
so that
blend
this is still
away? So it's
one-
still part of who we
Right.
are. Or like, yeah, so that's
Right.
part of that leadership
Right.
process, right? And
Right.
if you don't, if you
Right.
just try and like now run 2 streams, those eventually branch off into 4 streams, and then you end up with this delta of ministries that waters down your
Takes all the
mission,
power,
and it
yeah.
takes away all of the momentum of your church, and you start to decline because you
Yes.
have people who are really passionate about this, and this person's really passionate about that, and you've lost
Right. Right.
you've lost the
Right.
main river.
So there's a movie called City Slickers.
Oh, classic.
Yeah.
That's available now. I saw it recently.
I saw
Who
it.
has
Yeah,
Is
it's on
Netflix or
Amazon
somebody?
Prime. Or
okay,
one
yeah.
of- yeah. So we talk about, one of the things we talk about in church leadership development is it comes from that movie, and that's what's called the Curly Principle.
Yeah.
And the Curly Principle is that
He's like
scene,
the grizzled old cowhand.
grizzled
Yeah.
old cowhand, and he's asking, what's the secret of life? And he holds up, he says, this is it.
Just his index finger.
Yeah. Just his index finger. He says, this is it. And the guy says, what, your finger? He says, no, one thing. Do one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, a lot of churches will disintegrate when they get to the top of the apex, whether that's 50 years, whether it's 100 years, because they haven't communicated their one thing well to their new members and to their next generation. They haven't communicated, this is the one thing that makes our church different. This is the one thing that drives our church in our pursuit of Christ and in our disciple making. This is our one thing.
Yeah.
And when that communication of the one thing doesn't happen, then the deltas start happening.
Right.
Because you can't bring people back to the table. It's every idea coming out. I think we need to minister. We need to start a soup kitchen, or we need to start. And then what happens is something that really Marsh struggled with at one point in its life, and that is you have I'm going to say a third of the congregation that is actively pursuing ministry in a church.
Mm-hmm.
I know we talk about 10%. The 10% are the people who actually do almost everything, but you have 30% of a church that actually involves themselves in it, and they're trying to decide: do I do Awana, or do I do the missions team, or do I do? And yeah, sure, you can do more than one job.
Mm-hmm.
But you're fighting against yourself as a church. You're diluting what you're supposed to do. And as soon as you start diluting, you've apexed.
Yeah.
Now, really, you don't want to get to the apex before you start redefining your ministry. You definitely don't want to try and do it here because the momentum's going the wrong direction.
Yeah.
You want to do it, I'm sorry, podcast people, you don't want to do it on the downside of the incline. That's the wrong moment.
It just takes so much more effort to turn the roller coaster around.
It surely does.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to let it crash all the way down.
You do, absolutely.
Sometimes it is easier to let it crash and hit the bottom and then rebuild than it is to stop at mid-decline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so, the key is to notice the deceleration of the incline.
Yes. There's the key, right? The moment we're like, okay, the things are going really, really great, but everybody's getting very comfortable.
Yeah.
That's the moment where you have to say, okay, we have to realign
around this mission. What's the next step? Now that we've reached this point.
Yeah.
What is the next way? What's the next way to impact the next generation?
Yeah.
If you're a next gen ministry, or what's the next way to send people off or to impact the mission field or impact the nations, or what's the next way to develop strong worship and great music? All the, churches have these different things. And I love that. I think that if a church has a great passion for music ministry and writing original songs, right, they get to bless the rest of the church, because now all the churches don't have to stray from their passion for children's ministry to equip a team to be music writers.
Right.
They say, this is great theologically sound music. Let's bring that in. I don't have to invent this. I can continue to focus over here on raising up the next generation for Jesus, right?
Exactly.
Or
right.
I can focus all my energy back on sending out the next missionary to the field for a full-time ministry work, right? Or I can plant another church. I can segment out another quarter of my congregation and plant a new church in a new area of my community, because that's what our passion is and that's what our driving force is.
Yeah.
Having all of these different driving forces, I think, is entirely appropriate and good for the church as a whole.
Sure.
But it is very difficult, particularly for the average church, because the average church in the United States now is less than 80.
Right. Right.
It used to be 100, and now it's 50 to 80 is the average.
80, yes.
And so, you picture that average sized church in the United States of 50 to 80 people. You've only got so much energy and only so much volunteer hours to do something. And if you are trying to scatter all of those, you're going to wear everybody out, and you're never going to make it to 100.
Yes.
This is because I haven't talked about running yet. This is a marathon.
Yes. Yeah.
This is, church ministry, church leadership. This is poising your ministry for a long-term direction. And the responsibility of a pastor and all of that is to steward that direction well while they're serving in that place.
Right.
The responsibility of the members is to recognize that they're stepping into a stewardship of leadership also. That their ministry that they're a part of was handed to them by great leaders before them, and they should be preparing to hand off their ministry to the great leaders that come behind them. And that's how churches move from celebrating their 50th anniversary to their 500th anniversary. Should the Lord wait.
And one of the things here that goes into this is redefining your vision isn't changing your vision from one aspect, one definition to another. It could just be refining it according to what's going on in your world. So it's kind of
because there was a day where the bus ministry was part of that ministry,
worked.
But part of that vision for reaching the next generation.
Sure.
Now, when a parent won't let their little Timmy outside of their sight, it's really hard to take them away to a church that their parent has never been to. And so it's hard to run a bus ministry like that, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you change your vision for kids.
No, it means that you do what the scripture talks about, the sons of Zebulun who understood the times and the seasons, right? So
Issachar, men
of Issachar. Yeah, I knew it was one of the three tribes up north.
Guys, yeah.
Asher, Zebulun, and Issachar. Yeah. Across the top. Anyway, so they understood the times and the seasons, right? In other words, They knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
They saw their world. They identified the world. So one of the things that you do is you say, okay, I have a children's ministry church. What's my world look like?
Mm-hmm.
What do parents need for me to do for their kids?
Yeah.
How do I break into that noise that's going on in that world? Or I recognize my church. There are churches around our area. We have a state university in Massachusetts and a local town here in Lowell. There's a church over there that's doing a great job with
college students.
Yeah. Beautiful. They understand their times and their seasons. They know where God put them. They're actually ministering to college students. It's a brilliant thing. And that's something that's very popular here in the greater Boston area because the greater Boston area
we
has
have a
more
handful of
students
colleges
per
here.
capita
Yeah.
than the average city.
I think the city of Boston loses 300,000 residents in the summer.
It is the youngest city in the United States, which is pretty crazy.
Wild. It's understanding where you're put, where God has placed you, and then thriving accordingly. Yeah. And trying to remain focused on that, but not so locked in that you can't creatively address your driving force.
Sure. I have a friend who pastors a church, a fellow I know. I guess I'll call him a friend. Pastors a church in a local town that has gone from being a mill town agricultural town, in that there are people that worked in the mills. They would drive to the mills or they had farms.
Mm-hmm.
And over the last 40 years, all of those farms have been sold into McMansions.
Mm-hmm.
And now the community is full of doctors, dentists, very, very wealthy people with exceptionally expensive houses. And his little church of 50 is dwindling on a regular basis because his people are factory workers and electricians and just kind of very blue collar. And he was saying, I just don't know how we minister anymore. And I said, well, brother, you either have to do one of two things. You have to take your church and move it to where blue collar people are, or you're going to have to figure out how to reach the rich, because that's who you are. And he looked at me kind of odd, like, how do I reach the rich? But that's where he's been put. And he needs to identify, this is my world. I either take my blue collar people and we move to a blue collar town where we could minister, or I learn how to reach dentists for Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just for, they love their crowns.
They do. Oh, yes, they do.
Man, well, we should probably close out this and post it.
Yeah. But a church,
it feels like a root canal.
Yeah, right. But a church needs to constantly be measuring their driving force compared to the world that they live in and identifying how they advance their driving force.
Yeah.
Because then they'll continue to be a growing, healthy church for another 100 years.
Yeah. So there you go. That's how you get to be an old church.
Yeah.
Identifying your driving force and then being, I guess, flexible enough to continue to focus on your driving force.
Yes. Yeah. And refine it.
Mm-hmm.
Refining it.
Yeah.
Can we just take a moment and say Merry Christmas to everyone? I think that this is our last podcast before Christmas comes.
It's true.
And we're actually going to take a couple weeks hiatus.
Which should be nothing new to our audience. We do that occasionally.
We do.
But we're actually doing it intentionally now.
We're intentionally going.
We got some vacation time coming up.
We have some vacation time coming up.
So we'll see you back here in the new year.
New year.
Yeah. So God bless. We'll see you back here soon. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll talk to you all, I guess, next time.
Year.
Bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to Inside the Pastor Study podcast with Pastors George and Jeremy Stevens. Artwork by Caitlin Gallagher, music by Sam Demetrius, and engineering help from Ashley Gallagher. To find out more about us, head to marshcorner.com.